The death toll from an explosion outside a school in Afghanistan's capital, Kabul, has risen to 68. Afghan officials say doctors are struggling to provide medical care to at least 165 injured students. Families of the victims have blamed the Afghan government and Western powers for failing to put an end to violence.
It should have been a place of learning for young Afghans, but on Saturday afternoon it was the scene of a bloody attack. Backpacks, textbooks, a pair of girls' shoes, all remnants of an explosion outside a Kabul school. Officials say the death toll has risen to at least 68, with doctors struggling to provide medical care to the 165 injured. An eyewitness told Reuters all but 7 or 8 of the victims were schoolgirls going home after finishing their lessons. At a nearby hospital, doctors tend to the injured and distressed relatives search for their loved ones. This girl says they were just leaving school when a car exploded. Outside, people read the names of the victims. Inside a morgue, a man looks for his relatives among the bodies. Afghan President Ashraf Ghani blamed the attack on Taliban insurgents on Saturday, but a spokesman for the Taliban denied involvement, saying the group condemns any attacks on Afghan civilians. Families of the victims blamed the Afghan government and Western powers for failing to put an end to violence. The attack comes a week after remaining US and NATO troops began exiting Afghanistan with a mission to complete the drawdown by September 11, which will mark the end of America's longest war.
Well, to discuss this issue further, we are now joined by the founder and editor-in-chief of the Afghan Eye publication, Ahmed-Waleed Kakar, live from London in the United Kingdom. Ahmed, a very good evening to you. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to The Globe.
Thank you very much for having me.
Ahmed, are you at liberty perhaps to share with us the latest with regards to the death toll and more developments in Afghanistan?
So this attack actually took place, as you mentioned, yesterday, with the death toll still climbing. As of yet, there's been no claim of responsibility for this quite heinous attack. However, the Taliban have, as the report mentions, come out and condemned it. But all indicators sort of point to the fact that this is an attack that's typical of Daesh or the Islamic State in Afghanistan. This attack took place in West Kabul in an area called Dasht-e-Barchi, which has frequently been attacked by Daesh before for the reason that it houses, it's predominantly inhabited by the Shia religious minority. Last year, there was the infamous, similarly heinous attack on a maternity ward in which newborn babies and their mothers were killed. And so this it reflects the failure of the government to provide security for an area of Afghanistan, or specifically the capital, which has repeatedly been targeted in these sorts of attacks.
Now, the United States and the Taliban signed a deal last year to end the 20-year war, which began after Osama bin Laden, was intercepted by the Taliban. It seems that this deal, does nothing to end hostilities.
Well, the deal actually was more of a withdrawal agreement for the USA under certain terms and conditions that the Taliban and the USA gave, the guarantees that they gave each other. Part of the deal obviously included intra-Afghan negotiations, a resultant reduction in violence. That didn't happen, or it was delayed rather by 6 months, because the Afghan government, which wasn't a party to those negotiations, refused to comply by the agreement's clause of a prisoner exchange between the Afghan government and the Taliban. And so we've seen that with President Biden's announcement of withdrawal of US forces, he's actually broken the Doha agreement, which stipulated a deadline for US withdrawal for May the 1st. May the 1st has now passed. And because of that deadline that's passed, we've seen a surge in violence, not just sort of attacks on schoolgirls, but we've also seen a surge of violence between the Afghan government forces and the Taliban in a variety of different districts, provinces in Afghanistan. Civilian casualties have soared, and that has been missing from the coverage. The fact that whilst Biden has announced a total withdrawal by September the 11th, 2021, that it broke the Doha agreement, and the Taliban are technically with the agreement broken, the Taliban are at liberty to press their military advantage on the battlefield.
Well, the neighborhood in western Kabul where the blasts occurred is home to many from the Hazara minority community who are of Mongolian and Central Asian descent, I do understand, and are mainly Shia Muslims. You reckon this is a direct attack to the Shia Muslims in that country?
It definitely is. Daesh has repeatedly attacked religious minorities in Afghanistan, the Shia predominantly amongst them. And so this has all of the hallmarks of a Daesh attack, despite the fact that the pro-Afghan President Mohammed Ashraf Ghani, blamed the Taliban. The Taliban have obviously come out, condemned the attack in quite strong terms. And so, as I've mentioned previously, this attack follows other attacks in this specific neighborhood of Kabul where the Shia minority are predominant. And the Afghan government, unfortunately, for one reason or another, has failed to guarantee the security of the citizens there.
And interestingly, Ahmed, the Taliban is not the only one to condemn the latest incident. And one very prominent figure is Malala. Remember her, the young girl who was shot in the head by the Taliban back in 2012. She tweeted, and I'm going to read that tweet verbatim. She says that in Kabul, terrorists committed a horrendous attack on school children, most of them girls. The escalation of terrorism is alarming for peace and democracy in Afghanistan. World leaders must unite to safeguard school children. My heart is with the Kabul school victims' families. Now, Malala was shot by the Taliban, the very same group which is distancing itself from the latest violence.
Well, yes. First of all, I may say that that was a tweet of hers with which I wholeheartedly agree. This is a despicable attack. It sort of sets back any sort of inch of progress that Afghanistan has made in the sector of education over the last 2 decades. However, Malala was actually shot in the head, as you mentioned, by the Taliban. However, the Pakistani Taliban, and whilst the Afghan and the Pakistani Taliban do share a common name, indeed the Pakistani Taliban claim to have been inspired by the Afghan Taliban, they followed quite different trajectories. The Pakistani Taliban sort of was an umbrella organization comprising numerous different factions, and they have been regrouping recently. However, the Taliban that we're speaking of within the borders of the Afghan state had, they weren't the ones who are directly guilty of shooting Malala in the head.
So what seems to be behind the increased violence in Afghanistan?
Well, what's the increase? So as you mentioned, the Doha Agreement has failed to sort of provide peace for Afghanistan, and the fact of the matter is that it was sort of expected that whilst intra-Afghan negotiations would take place, that fighting would take place. That was the case with the U.S. negotiations with the Taliban that led to the Doha Agreement. Whilst the two sides were negotiating, violence soared in Afghanistan. Civilian casualties, unfortunately, perhaps inevitably, soared alongside it. And so with the recent announcement by President Biden of a withdrawal by September that broke the Doha Agreement, the Taliban have escalated pressure on the military side of things. Today, in fact, just now, we've received confirmation that the Taliban will announce a customary 3-day ceasefire for the Islamic festival of Eid that is upcoming in the next few days. However, despite that, the Taliban, because the agreement has been broken, there's very little reason for them to not there's very little reason for them to abide by the tenets of the agreement and to not press their military advantage on the battlefields. And unfortunately, that has resulted in civilian casualties. In Logar, in Logar province, just south of Kabul, there was a massive explosion in which the Taliban, it was claimed rather that Afghan militiamen were killed. However, it was reported that civilians died. In Helmand province in the south of Afghanistan, traditionally a stronghold of the Taliban, airstrike killed members, women and children amongst them of the same family. Similar scenes were sort of seen in Baghlan, and the fighting in Afghanistan has metastasized and changed. We're now seeing more sort of street-to-street, house-to-house fighting. Footage has emerged of the Afghan government and the Taliban alike using civilian property to fight against one another. And those sorts of things, unfortunately, they lead to an increased likelihood of civilian casualties. And because the Taliban have little reason to reduce violence, albeit with the recent announcement of the Eid ceasefire, because there's little reason to abide by the Doha Agreement, violence has unfortunately soared.
You make very valid points there, Ahmed, and I mean it brings to my next question with regards to the involvement of the Islamic State group, as we do understand that it continues to carry out a vicious campaign and targeting the softest of targets in that particular country. And we know that the Islamic State is not part of the peace talks between the Taliban and the Afghan government. Any likelihood that these three parties could find common ground and end hostilities in Afghanistan?
Well, the Islamic State, like you mentioned, is the third party to the conflict, and it's not bound by any sort of agreement with the Taliban or with the Afghan government. And so we've seen a sort of a similar sort of trajectory with the Islamic State or Daesh in Iraq and Syria, that whenever it was sort of under pressure or whenever it was sort of fading away, it started to launch quite vicious, quite brutal attacks in a variety of different places in the world. And the same is the case in Afghanistan. The Daesh group in Afghanistan were defeated and essentially eliminated from a sort of a collection of different valleys in northeastern Afghanistan. However, like you mentioned, soft targets, this is what Daesh does. It attacks soft targets, it carries out sort of heinous attacks in the hope that this would gain some sort of sick relevance in the public discussion. And so the Daesh or the Islamic State and the Taliban have fought each other quite brutally. They have obviously very deep theological, religious differences with one another. Daesh was initially led by sort of a breakaway faction of the Taliban. The Taliban actually accused the Afghan government and the Americans of sort of aiding Daesh to fight against the Taliban. Sort of an enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of rationale was something that the Afghan government was accused of having, and actually facilitating the escape or the rise of Daesh in Afghanistan in a possible attempt to weaken the Taliban. And so whilst the government in Kabul and the Taliban, we hope and we pray, can come to some sort of arrangement that would facilitate peace in Afghanistan and the end of hostilities, Daesh, which is ideologically and religiously opposed to both of those institutions or those organizations, would not naturally be party to that. And the real danger and the real fear is that in order to remain relevant, it would carry out attacks like this against religious minorities in order to sort of fan the flames of sectarian conflict. And that's dangerous because obviously sectarian conflict is something that doesn't recognize borders and that other neighboring countries can also exploit for its goals and purposes.